think most of the time when people say audit or I'm getting audit, maybe they're worried, they're fearful, the unknown, haven't been through this before, when we talk to other people. So what we wanted to present today and talk through is really how to, we say survive an audit, but it's not surviving it. It really shouldn't be looked at something that's negative. It's usually a very useful tool. And so Frank and I just want to talk through our experiences. We audit a lot of facilities, and we've both been doing this for several years. We've seen a lot of different industries and really encountered a lot of EHS managers, plant managers, maintenance personnel that are all involved in the audit process. So let me make sure I can advance my slides. So want to talk through a little bit. The key, honestly, is pre-day prep, pre-audit preparation. What are we going to do in advance so everything goes smooth when it comes to the audit? And then talk through some common audit findings. Let's really not give the auditors some of those easy pickings that they have. But when we talk about audits being helpful, right? Why do I want to do this? Maybe I don't have a choice and I'm being audited from corporate, or maybe I do have a choice and I'm doing a self-audit or maybe auditing a sister facility. And really looking at audits at a time and a program that can be useful and helpful to each person. So it's a time to review your programs, maybe reset your programs, reset understanding of facility people about how to manage EHS compliance and update each of these programs. So as Frank and I encounter EHS managers, actually where he is this week, he's working internationally. And one of the sites, EHS managers has only been on site for 8 weeks. And we're actually doing an assessment of the facility. And then I was at a facility 2 weeks ago now, and the EHS manager had been there for over 50 years. And so when we talk about auditing, there's really things to learn if you've been there for 50 years or 8 weeks. We've had a lot of EHS personnel transition these last couple of years. So if you're joining us today, you may be in a new facility that you've never worked in, very long, or maybe even in a new state and you don't know those regulations very well, or you're implementing an audit program. And so really the key is to look at these to help yourselves. Sometimes we can use the internal audits to your advantage, right? Oftentimes we see things that managers may have been bringing up that need capital improvement or approval from higher level corporate executives or plant management to say, we've been trying to upgrade the wastewater treatment system. We've been trying to add additional personnel to the facility to help. We've been trying to advance some programs that we need to. So sometimes audits can bring those issues to light and really provide a platform to give you a program or a conveyance to discuss it with people that need to hear it. So hopefully when you think audits, just don't view it as adversarial or daunting, rather, again, a tool for improvement, and it really is there to help. All of our clients that have audit programs in place, we look at them as we're on the same side of the fence, right? We would rather find things internally before we have a regulator come in and find it for us. So one thing to look at for your facility, and you think about your operations, is why am I getting audited? We can use the word audit for a variety of reasons. One may be a regulatory audit. If you're a Title V facility, a large quantity generator, maybe a PSM facility for OSHA purposes, you're going to get periodic inspections from those agencies. You may also have an unannounced audit. If you've had an injury or complaint, sometimes neighbors bring complaints if they're talking about odor or air emissions, and you may get an agency visit then that's unannounced. And then again, we may have internal requirements where we've got corporate practices where we have 3-year cycles that you're going to get an audit every 3 years, or maybe even internally, you're going to do those for sister facilities. Some of you may be ISO certified. There are EHS compliance audit requirements really under that ISO standard. And so we have a number of clients that say, can you come in and do my third-party assessment so that I can maintain my ISO certification? And then also due diligence. Some of you may have been through a due diligence action where you're going to get audited by your new owner so they can come in and establish a baseline of where we are today. And so we can move into the future and update environmental programs. So just talking about focus of the audit, making sure that I always feel like knowing is half the battle, right? Having a good grasp on what we're looking at too. Will your audit cover applicable EHS regulations only, compliance only? Or are we also looking at corporate procedures and standard work practices? Oftentimes those go hand in hand, and we may go into a facility and we're looking at compliance and then the programs that back that up that may have more substantive requirements than regulatory agencies, but it's really best practices or sustainable programs so that as you have transitions, you're maintaining compliance at all times. You may also be looking at external program requirements for another agency or another entity that has regulation over our site. So just want to always convey that treat it more than just a checkbox. We have seen that, frankly, where people just want to say, yes, I had an audit, but at the end of the day, you're really not looking at what the corrective action is, maybe trying to more band-aid the issue and not delve into why do we have these findings, where can we improve and enhance and strengthen the foundations of our program. Again, just knowing where you're headed. As we talk audit throughout this presentation, we can use the word audit, we can use inspection, we can use gap assessment, baseline evaluation, any number of things that we talk about, but it's getting us to the same point. It's starting with our programs, plans, permits, procedures where we are today, and looking at how we're in compliance with regulatory programs. When we talk audits as well and the audience, knowing who's going to get this information is key in order to say, what are the results of this? So as we know, if we have a regulatory audit or inspection, we could have an NOV or a citation or finding of no issues that come from that, but it's very much the same process. If you're having a third-party audit, then it may just be a report out of compliance findings. Maybe we've got a priority ranking, high, medium, low, class 1, class 2, class 3, that we're reporting out and discussing. We may also have observations. A number of our clients and a number of our audits have that category. We can say, this is not a regulatory finding today, but it may lead to a finding, or it's ways that we need to, again, enhance or update our program to make it clearer. Usually it's updating documentation and backup rationale as to why we're doing something or not doing something, and potentially on the training side as well. So back to our ISO group, for those of you that are ISO certified, sometimes this audit is going to result in either maintaining ISO certification or needing to have a reassessment down the road. So again, when you start thinking about an audit program and how you're being audited, what are those end results going to be? So a few notes, always preparation is key. I think we know that, but auditability. I know one thing that Frank and I see a lot as we are out at facilities is really accessibility to files. So a few comments just about preparing in advance for an audit of how am I going to get the files? Sometimes as an EHS manager, I may maintain all those myself. I may have multiple filing cabinets with years of reports and training records and documentation. And a lot of facilities, though, are going to less paper, right? We're going to SharePoints, we're going to online databases, but really accessibility of that information is key. So knowing how can I get my hands on it? How can I do it quickly? How can I distill that information for an auditor? And frankly, on the electronic side, because for environmental programs, we submit so many reports electronically through various state and agency portals that we actually don't have hard copies anymore. But maintaining screenshots or bounce back emails or verification that we submitted reports on time is key for the audit. So as an auditor, if you come in and say, I need 3 years of your tier 2 reports, well, in most cases, those are all online now. So go ahead and print those down to the file or be able to show them electronically to say, they were submitted on this day, on this time, and I submitted them in a compliant manner. So when it comes to auditing, one key is just take the time to prepare that backup documentation, take the time to really get your files in order so it's easier for you, frankly, during the audit week or the audit days to be able to pull and access information. Same thing when we talk about accessibility of system items, this trust but verify, right? We push a lot of programs down to people in the facility. Maintenance may maintain some, HR or training coordinators maintains records, area operators and personnel also maintain records. And so before you're audited, when things are calm, not before reporting season on the environmental side, or not before, maybe a big health and safety upgrade or working through lockout tagout programs or something, but when it's quiet, walk through the system and really know who is responsible for what. Again, accessibility to systems, and chase things down through them. Maintenance, I don't want to pick on maintenance personnel, but a lot of times things are in maintenance work order systems, and we know that they're being conducted, but when it comes to extracting that information, finding it, being able to print out a period of time to say this is what we did for the last year, the last 2 years, sometimes that's a little harder than we think it is. Same thing for training records. I've had 2 audits here lately where the training coordinator has been out for one reason or another. They're out on leave, they can be out on vacation, they're out on maternity leave. We've had that too. And so the result is we actually can't get to those records because they're the only ones with access. And so we have to leave that as let's follow up on that later when we can actually review the information. So it's always important to think through that. And even though we trust people are doing their jobs, it's good to sometimes poke at those processes a little bit. Just a few notes on audit do's and don'ts, because we usually always talk about this too. We know that we need to inform everyone that's going to be there that we have an audit going on. And honestly, probably the most important bullet point is probably this 4th one about just always answer questions truthfully and honestly. And, on the next slide, sometimes the answer is I don't know, or I'm not sure, or I'll have to find out. I know when we talk about surviving an audit, and sometimes the most stressful pieces of an audit is that an auditor may get a response to a question that is maybe not as accurate, or maybe there's some misunderstanding of the process and you end up chasing things down that actually don't end up, being the case. So I know sometimes I've asked operators, I had one about a lead pot. We were talking about lead bars and where do you use it? And the first answer was, we don't use those. And it's like, well, everything's labeled as lead, and we're talking about IH and hazardous waste management. And so then we had to spend some time getting the operator, and they said, oh, we do use the lead bars, and here they are. So sometimes I think on the do's and don'ts are just sticking to the issue, answering the question, and then always understanding the findings before the auditor leaves. I think that's key. When we talk about the process, just having debriefs with the audit team, asking for those if you don't have them already, but really having a good understanding that there's no error of fact or misstatements, that everybody's clear on the process. And so when you do have a finding that says we're using lead in this area and we haven't appropriately assessed it, we can all agree to those facts. Again, just don't try to create information at the time of the audit. I know there's a tendency sometimes to maybe say, oh, we can get that inspection report put together tonight, or submit something real quick, and it just makes it easier on you and the auditors if that's not the case. And again, just saying, I don't know, is a great response, and sometimes not trying to think ahead of the auditor of where they're going. Think about somebody walking into your facility for the very first time, potentially, that may or may not know your processes, and it takes them a little while to understand what's going on and distill enough questions to then get to the compliance items. Couple things on the management side too. I know that a lot of our corporate partners will insist that we don't try to fix everything immediately from an audit. I know that's the first reaction is if you find something, I'm going to want to fix it. I want to prove that it's no longer an issue. Some things, labeling of containers, or container management, or cleaning up spills, or oil or waste, can be done at the time of the audit, but there's a lot of things that need some thoughtful consideration and maybe need a little bit more time to evaluate, to understand what the real issue is, and then putting corrective actions in place. So just overall, in the big pictures of audits, sometimes you just need to let those things sit for a little bit and think through it. And then same thing, the number of findings. So I know our natural tendencies are to say, wow, you had 50 findings from this audit, that's a lot. But it's really important to understand the scope. Are these systemic issues where we found multiple items throughout, or is it isolated? And really be able to put those into some buckets to say, where are my real issues in my program, if there are any that are coming out from an audit? But again, this is where the audits can be helpful to identify, hey, we reviewed 80 confined space permits and only one of them did not have all the information, or we reviewed 3 years of manifest and one of them was incomplete versus we're missing 2 or 3 years of records. So just keeping it in perspective. A few things on audit activities. If you've been through an audit, you should know these, but sometimes we've got a lot of people that have never been through an audit before. So typically standard, we're looking at an opening and closing meeting. You're going to do a site tour and then get back and start reviewing records and interviews with employees. So just know that during that week or a few days that you're being audited, really having everybody on standby and understanding their role in the EHS management system. And then they also need to be prepared to answer questions or talk about their processes or operations. So typically those interviews are very informal, and usually it's just, tell me how you do this. Can you explain to me the process? Can you provide these records or logs? So again, not daunting to the people, and it's usually just having them explain what they do because they know better than the auditor does, and we're just trying to get to the bottom of the issues. A few things, just notes, again, make sure and schedule daily debriefs if it's not already part of your audit program, just to make sure that it's very clear and open about what the auditors are seeing, what they're finding, and being able to prepare for the next day. Again, take that stress off of you, that there's no surprises as you go through this process. That's really key, is to say, I know what you've seen, I agree with what you've seen, and we're ready for the next day. Similarly, for the closing meeting, the goal of any audit, at least that we're involved in, is that there's no surprises when we start reporting out to maybe plant management or corporate personnel or site level personnel, and just making sure that everything is clear and concise and reported to the facility so that you have a very defined roadmap of what's been going on during the week. And then post-audit review, again, just kind of in general, most of the time you're going to get an audit report, maybe a tabular listing. We've got some clients that use online portal systems where we will actually upload findings and then it will assign a responsible person to close those findings out and identify root cause or corrective actions. And then you'll be able to look at that report and go through it. And then many people, if you haven't established already, there's a cadence to closing out findings, 30, 60, 90 days, 60, 100, 180 days, or something like that, so that you have time again to thoughtfully go through and figure out what the issue is and how to correct it. I do have one client that when we audit for them, fortunately, the client actually tells the people, the facility, like, shut off the audit. I don't want you to, we're not going to provide a report for maybe till about a week after. But that gives the auditee some time to say, okay, I had the audit, it's done, there's nothing I can do about it now. And then the findings are written up, and kind of when you get some sleep, have a couple nights to rest, and then you come back and say, okay, now let's talk through the findings and where we are. So I do appreciate that sometimes, because those weeks can be very frantic, and trying to absorb and distill a lot of information at one time can sometimes be difficult. So when we talk about going on the floor, so when we talk about auditing, really common findings that we're seeing is just know that the auditors are going to look everywhere, and you may have a set path for them to walk, and they're not going to walk that path. It happens every time. They're going to want to look around every door in every cabinet, looking at containers. And again, don't give them easy findings. So making sure that you're walking the facility, or somebody is, frankly, with a fresh set of eyes, and looking at the process to say, I haven't looked behind that machine lately, or I haven't followed this drain line, or looking in areas that we may not always follow. In fact, we had a electrical room that someone had set up a desk in the electrical room because it was quiet, it was out of the way. And even the manager was like, I had no idea this was here. I don't ever go in the room and around the corner. And those are the places the auditors go. So when we talk about the tour, just looking at all the areas, and just be resigned to the fact that auditor's luck that I've got on here, inevitably something will have happened over the weekend or the morning of or the night before that will pop up and you've never seen it before. In fact, just had that in an audit last week. They did a tank clean out on a Saturday and a Sunday. We showed up Monday morning. and there were containers of waste that had not been properly managed. It just happened to be timing. And so we say, well, we're gonna fix it and do better next time. Same thing on this, just a couple of pictures because pictures always help and break things up. But this truly was a weekend clean out. Thankfully, maintenance got the word that we were auditing, and this was 8 o'clock on Monday morning. And when they heard we're having an audit, then they cleaned out every single aerosol can in the facility and dumped it at the puncturer. So it's like, well, thank you, but this isn't really how we wanted to manage that. So same thing, universal waste for those on the environmental side of the house. This happens too. We have a clean out. We generated them all at once, and here they are. We walk in the room and say, it's never looked like this before. A few containers. This is kind of a classic. You can see it was an empty container because if we're starting at Monday morning, it's amazing that usually all the haz waste is shipped off site. The universal waste is gone and all the trash cans are empty and clean, but this one wasn't, so this is I have told them to not do this, and it happens. So sometimes these audits, again, are good tools to reinforce the behaviors that we want within the facility. Last one on the photos, only because this is one that I like to show. I know this client very well. And this is when it's saying, I don't know, or not giving an answer that maybe the wrong one is the best. There were a number of paint cans, and the response was, those are all dry, they're empty, they're about to go in the trash. I said, it's not dry, it's not empty, put your finger in there. So he did. He poked his finger in there, and of course the bottom of the can was still liquid. So these type of things, again, it's a good time to look at that. It was a good practice to say we need to manage these differently, and then of course I got a good photo out of it for later. So when we talk about auditing itself, Frank actually came up with this when we were chatting one time, and he said, I really think 80% of my time, meaning health and safety, is on the floor, and only 20% is records review. And for me, probably 80% of my time doing environmental programs is records, and I'm on the floor 20% of the time. And I certainly think that's applicable, only because, and Frank will talk, when we do an audit, we're typically going to do EHS at the same time and split up. And he's going to go out on the floor and look at equipment and machines and programs and procedures on the floor. And then I'm the one sitting in the conference room with 15 files on the table going through 3 years of records. So just one thing to consider when you're planning for audits, or frankly doing your own audit, and where should I spend my time when I'm trying to focus on one single program. So Frank, exactly. I'm going to turn it over to you for safety.
Thanks, Amy. And yeah, everything that Amy went through, quite honestly, applies equally to health and safety as it does environmental. So it really doesn't matter what media is being audited at any given time. All those tips or ideas that Amy had refer to both. But this is where I think it kind of diverges a little bit. And that's why I wanted that slide in there, in that when Amy and I audit, yes, there are compliance health and safety programs that demand you to look at documents, whether it be you have to have a written program or you have to have a record or a permit or something like that. But in reality, most of the stuff that you look for when you're doing a health and safety audit is really out on the floor. And you want to walk around, observe things and that kind of stuff. Whereas Amy's right, a lot of her work that she does is reviewing permits, reviewing records of wastewater management, reviewing records of sampling, of waste streams and that kind of thing. And a lot of it is spent in a conference room. So when we audit, we kind of, do both, but, it usually ends up being kind of an 80-20, 70-30 kind of thing. And I just wanted to go through some of the safety programs that kind of to touch on some of the topics that I see that may be helpful to you as an auditee. So I'm going to start with some permits. Again, this is the record keeping. If you have hot work, if you have confined spaces, or you guys work at heights, you may have to have a permit that demonstrated that you did it right. Don't throw those away. You got to keep those on site. Hot work, typically, all these things, typically you want to keep a year's worth of permits to demonstrate that you guys are doing what you're supposed to do. The right people are looking at the space, looking at the work, and they're signing off, and you have a process. So, there's a tendency to, try to limit paperwork and try to narrow it down. But in many cases, you have to keep these records on file. And this is some of the things I look at. Another one that comes up quite often is control of hazardous energy, lockout, tagout. And it's not only required that you have written energy control procedures, which, if you have a big facility and lots of equipment, that could be a daunting task in its own right. But you have to have a written program, and you have to have authorized and affected workers and training and all sorts of other things, because that is a pretty complicated program. And quite honestly, this is something that we're usually involved with equipment maintenance or facilities maintenance. They're usually drivers of this program. And again, during an audit, we're going to go down to their offices and we're going to see where are their locks, where are their tags, how do they manage the keys, and if you're, as Amy says, lucky, we will observe lockouts in progress. As we walk through the site, Amy and I are looking for that. We're looking for that red lock that's behind the counter, and then we yank on it and say, "Oh, what's this?" And invariably, we find it so covered with dirt you can't even read the label. And you pull it out, and sure enough, that thing's been locked out for 6 months. And it turns out it's not really locked out; it's out of service. And that's a whole animal in its own right. And we start talking about lockout, tag out for maintenance versus out of service, et cetera. So that's just one of the things we look at for a lockout, tag out. But energy control procedures is key. You want to make sure you have equipment specific energy control procedures and they're well documented, because quite honestly, that's really how people safely manage locking out and their equipment. And we've been to enough sites where they might have some energy control procedures. I've been to sites where they don't have any energy control procedures. So, depending on how mature your site is, this is something that you really want to focus on. Another area, electrical safety. Electrical safety is a very complex area. If you look at OSHA guidance and things like that, it gets into great detail because it's not strictly OSHA. You got to look at the National Fire Protection Association regulations as well, or standards that OSHA has adopted. And so when you're looking at arc flash, NFPA 70E, those things apply. Even though if you look in the OSHA compliance records, you're looking at straight electrical safety, arc flash is something you have to consider, and it is something that you have to train to, something you have to have PPE for, that kind of thing. So don't overlook that. I always ask the question of the maintenance folks, where does the utility stop and where do you begin? And again, different facilities have different answers to that. Some facilities are getting their hands right into switchgear, which that's a unique expertise. And I always ask the question: are people trained at that level? Other sites say, no, no, no. The utility deals with that. We only deal with the step down voltages, and this is where we start in this motor control room or whatever. Again, as an auditor, I want to know where your risk starts and where the utility's risk ends. And so that's something you got to think about as well as you're being thought about being audited. Hey, where does this end? Is that transformer in the corner of the property ours, or is it the utilities? And you'd be surprised how many times people that throw up their hands go, I don't know. I don't know. We've never had to deal with it. I don't know who owns that transformer. So things to think about, and when you get to scope of audit, how broad is the audit? You go to the next slide, Amy.
Didn't click. Mm-hmm.
There you go. Powered industrial trucks. Again, if you're in a warehouse, or not even in a warehouse, but if you have a lot of PITs roaming around, again, we're going to look at some records. We're going to look at training records and that kind of thing. But quite honestly, I'm going to really look at the condition of the trucks and watch how they're being used, because that's really going to tell me how good your program is. You can have the nicest training records and you can have nice certificates and everybody's carrying a license in their wallet. But if I see them flying around, no seatbelts being used, really risky behaviors with how the loads are handled, that kind of thing, that's an indication of the strength of the program. That's really what, again, a health and safety auditor is going to do. Yeah, they can look at the training records and say, oh, it looks like everybody's got a license. That's wonderful. But you really can't assess that program until you watch and observe how those industrial trucks are working. And again, that could be one day, it could be multiple days during an audit. Went to one facility one time and they told me there was 3 authorized truck drivers. I said, great. So on day 4, I went out there and sure enough, there's a guy on the truck and he wasn't one of the 3. And I said, well, who's this guy? Oh, that's Joe. Yeah. I think he got trained at his previous job. So we let him drive. That's the kind of finding that, if I was an OSHA inspector, that'd be a big deal. But like Amy said, I try to be on your side. I'm saying, hey, you got to get a little tighter control over who manages the keys to these pieces of equipment. The other thing about powered industrial trucks, this is an aside, is that depending on the variety of equipment you have, you may have to have multiple licenses. So just because you have one, propane fork truck that has a certain capacity and everybody gets trained on that, You may also have to train them on some of the electric pallet jacks separately than just that. So don't only think that one license covers all. And again, it's pretty clear in the OSHA regulation that you have to train to the particular vehicle that folks are driving. Walking working surfaces, that's mostly a housekeeping issue. There may be some aspects of uneven surfaces or holes in the floor, but that's pretty rare unless you're at a construction site. But a lot of it has to do with housekeeping. You know, puddles on the floor, cords draped across working paths, a lot of water if you're working in a plating line and that kind of thing. You know, what's going on with the floor? Are people sloshing through it, or you have platforms to keep their feet out of it? That's the kind of stuff that an auditor is going to look for. Again, as Amy said, it's low hanging fruit. You know, it doesn't. You know, I'll just walk through, and sure enough, there'll be a puddle on the floor, and somebody will say, "Wait a second, that's never been there before. Where'd that puddle come from?" Well, it's there, and I see it. Okay, I'm going to start asking the same question. And what is it that you do to keep that from happening in the future? And where's that puddle? And what's the source of it? And quite honestly, sticking a yellow cone up there and saying "look out" is not usually an adequate control. And so again, that starts getting back into your incident management system. You know, if you see something like that, is there a way to track back to what is the real source of the problem? And is your site able to do that? And some sites can, some sites cannot. And that's part of, again, the audit process, is trying to dig through and figure out what are the systems in place to catch some things. Working at heights is another one. Again, a lot of folks don't understand that OSHA standard for industry is 4 feet. There's a lot of opportunity for folks who are working above 4 feet. Big one is loading docks. How high are your docks off the ground? If they're more than 4 feet, you have to have ways to keep people from falling off the docks. And that's usually a rigid barrier, keeping the doors closed, etc. But we all know in the summer, the doors like to remain open to get that nice draft going through the warehouse. You have to have another barrier there to protect folks from falling off those ledges. And working at heights affects not only that, but also any other, working at height with regard to working on catwalks or working in other surfaces that may not have adequate protection. And then it steps into the whole idea of personal fall arrest and other things. So all these things are fair game during an audit. Next slide, Amy. Just a few more things. Contractor safety. More and more, we look into contractor safety. Now, there is no standard on contractor safety per se. It is mentioned in the OSHA Process Safety Management Standard about what a contractor program should look like for process safety. But depending on where your operations are, for example, in California, they're pretty aggressive with contractor safety and holding the host company liable for contractor injuries. So it's good to have a strong contractor safety program. This is more of a management system approach, comes with training, orientation. Maybe it's some sort of a meeting system or a permit to work system that you guys have that will indicate how you convey risk information to the contractor and how the contractor conveys how they're going to work safely on your site. And there's usually, it's a meeting, whatever. Sometimes it's very formal. Sometimes that's all documented, which I would really encourage. Other times it's just a toolbox talk. But whatever it is, you should have something that you can defend as saying, this is how we manage contractors coming onto our site. Machine carding, again, that's something that you're going to observe. It's really hard to do a machine guarding assessment unless you're out there looking at the machines. And that's not only just a process area, but a lot of times maintenance has their own machine shops. There may be a lot of focus on getting the process equipment properly guarded, but then somebody forgets about the machine shop. And so we'll audit both. I usually ask, again, I'll ask the maintenance team or if there's a shop or a model shop, where is it located? It's usually in the back of the facility, or maybe even be in a Connex box in the back of the parking lot. But a lot of times, if we're auditing, we will find some findings there because a lot of that equipment tends to be older, tends not to be in the best condition, and a lot of times it's not guarded. And so your process areas may look great, but it's those machine shops in the back 40 that kind of get you in trouble sometimes. And then in general, emergency response, fire, medical, weather, how do you get people out of the building in the event of an emergency? And most companies, most sites are pretty good with this, but some sites struggle, especially around head counts, especially around rescue plans for things like confined space entry or confined space entry or working at heights. How do you get people out of harm's way if something goes wrong? And a lot of people say, well, I just called 911 and the fire department will respond. Well, we'll ask, have you ever tried that? Have you talked to the fire department? How quickly can they respond to your scenario? And some sites get surprised to find out that, by the way, it takes 10 or 15 minutes for the fire department to respond. And my question is that okay? Are you willing to wait that long, or do you want to have more capability within your own team to manage an emergency before the fire department comes? If you're going to rely on the fire department for a rescue, that's inadequate. You got to maybe create your own rescue team, or have whoever is entering that confined space or that contractor hire a rescue team to be on standby at the site to get you out of trouble. So those are some things to think about with emergency response. It's not just having a nice emergency response plan. It's really thinking a practical way through it of, how's this really going to work? Where drills come in, and have you really tested it? Next slide, Amy. I'm going to finish up with these. Fire life safety is really around your fire protection system, which is key, but also egress areas. If you have a facility up in the northern parts of the United States, what do you do in the winter to keep your emergency exits clear? Do you have a plan? Are people shoveling them out, snow blowing them so people can still get out those exits when there's a snowstorm? Do we see blocked exits? Do we see things draped across exits? That kind of stuff. And then obviously your fire life safety protection systems. A lot of time that's vendored out to a professional, which I would always encourage. But some people have in-house expertise. And how do you guys do that? Related to that, I usually sometimes ask for your insurance records, because a lot of times if you have a pretty big facility, you're going to have a large insurance provider that's going to come along and probably look at you every year. And they're going to give your own list of recommendations. And one thing I usually ask is, how are you guys doing with closing those recommendations out? Some of them are about, putting on new roofs or other ways to mitigate some risk. But some of them are really important, like there might be issues with structure, or there may be issues with fire life safety code that the insurance company will raise, that you as the owner of the facility need to resolve. And how are you doing with those resolutions? A lot of times, those insurance companies will just keep those recommendations on every report every year. And so I'll look at them and I'll say, well, how come this has been on the report for 3 years? What are you guys going to do about it? And a lot of times say, well, we're not going to do anything about it. And I said, well, then you should document that. Don't just let it ride, because if something were to happen, that's the kind of thing that an OSHA regulator is going to come in and hang you on, because it looks like you haven't taken any action. You may have decided not to take action because you've done 5 other things, but you should document that. Record keeping is pretty basic. OSHA logs, incident investigation. Process safety management only applies to those sites where you have above the threshold quantities for certain materials. But if anybody knows, process safety management is a pretty complex standard, lots of elements to it. And once you start down that path, it is a pretty progressive path that probably you need multiple people involved. Compressed gases, radiation, lasers, et cetera. All these things are fair game. A lot of times radiation is not so much about the safety. A lot of regulations on radiation are really about registering the devices with the state and paying your fee. Again, as an auditor, I usually say, okay, I see you got a few lasers here. Have you registered them with the state? What's the state's requirements about that? And a lot of times the site really doesn't know. They just have the laser. They didn't realize that they had a call and that they have to fill out a form and send in $150 to get a registration. And oh, by the way, they might have to designate a person as the laser safety officer. There may be other tests that they have to demonstrate or mail in. Those are the kind of things that can catch you if you're not paying attention to regulations. And I think that's about it for me, Amy. Chemical management. Oh,
Sure.
I almost forgot one of the most important ones. Sorry about that. Because as everybody knows, even if you're not a chemical facility, there's always chemicals there. And OSHA loves to look at HAZCOM as a way to find some citations. And so as an auditor, this is where I usually look as well. And to Amy's point, how do you manage your SDSs? Is it a paper copy or is it electronic? Almost everybody now deals with electronics. But even at that, there is a requirement you keep your inventory up to date. And I've been to a number of sites where they are relying on a third party for their SDSs, and it's not up to date. The third party is only as good as the input they're getting from your site. The SDSs may look nice. There may be a nice slick web page that you can get them from, but still, it has to match what's on the site. And so it's only as good as the information that you're feeding to them. And that's always a caution for some sites. Chemical labeling, an obvious one that we were looking at. Again, walking around and seeing that, we can talk till we're blue in the face about how good your chemical program is, but if you walk around and you see stuff that's unlabeled, that's not a good sign. Also, asking employees. This is something that OSHA would do, and so I try to mimic that, asking them, hey, where can I work? If I wanted to know, where can I find the chemical information here at this site? Hopefully, they'll be able to point me to a computer where the SDSs is, or it'll be pointing to a binder that's mounted on the wall, or something along those lines. You don't want them to just shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. Or they can say, well, I always talk to my supervisor about that. Hey, that's another good answer. And then I'll go to the supervisor and I'll say, okay, where do you find your chemical safety information? And hopefully they'll have a crisp answer. But that's the kind of stuff that, as an auditor, that's not something you're going to do in a conference room. That's something you're going to do walking around, talking to people, and seeing how people interact with their workplaces. Another one, how do new chemicals get introduced and approved? Is there a process for that? Looking in bulk storage areas, are things properly labeled? Are things properly managed? And then last but not least, industrial hygiene. Has anybody ever sampled for the chemicals that are in this area to determine whether or not anybody's exposed? A big flag for me is if I see somebody wearing a respirator. Okay, first question is, okay, how do they know they need a respirator? Do you have any data that suggests that they need to wear a respirator? And is it a condition of employment, or is it a voluntary thing? And that goes down the whole path of the respiratory protection program. And again, this is something that, I as an auditor are going to look at based on, what I see, how people are interacting with the process. And a lot of times you'll see the respirator sitting off on the side. I've found them on people's desks. I see them on top of their cabinets when they're getting changed. That's a trigger for me to say, okay, I see a respirator out there. Let's start looking at why they think they need it. And that usually opens up a few different pathways for auditing to continue. Now I think I'm done, Amy.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. Well, and on the chemical management, I'll pick up on that. So Frank and I have both been doing EHS work for long enough that we cross over, and chemical management's a big piece when you talk about when you're auditing. And again, what you should do at your facility is we look at a chemical on the floor, going to write that down. From an environmental standpoint, I may be looking at for air emission calculations, for tier 2 reporting, for Form R reporting, for waste management purposes. Frank's looking at it for employee exposure. Do we need to do IH sampling? And so that crossover of we're always looking at chemicals and taking things from the ground, from the floor up. So as I'll say through this last little bit for environmental programs, we're always pulling the thread that we would say. Like you said, if I see a respirator, I'm going to start asking, why are we using it? It's usually laying out beside the paint booth, not in a bag, not clean, right, Frank? Or if we see a chemical, then we're also going to talk amongst each other. Hey, did you see, I pulled this for air purposes. Did you see this has XX and X in it? And so making sure that when we talk auditing, and yes, looking at these programs as a whole, that's really how we're evaluating them. So quickly on the environmental side, like Frank said, now we see a number of things on the floor: waste, stormwater issues, SPCC oils, chemical handling, loading, unloading activities. But a large part of the environmental audit then are documents. Again, tracing things through the system. Can I see what's on the floor? And then I'm taking it all the way through the program. So a few common issues, again, the air permit, frankly, going condition by condition. Easy thing. We get permits issued. Actually, last week was at a facility that they had a brand new air permit issued June 15th, so barely a month old. They didn't really have time to look at it. The facility, or it had a statement from the agency that they were a major source of HAPs. Well, they're not a major source of HAPs, but that's a big red flag. When I read the permit before I got there, I highlighted everything and said, what's going on? So that's something where they're going to have to go back to an agency and fix the typo, but really going condition by condition. Again, chemically, looking at safety data sheets, a number of findings come out of formulation changes to the chemical supply chain, bought a different one. We changed vendors, therefore we changed the constituents, which also impacts health and safety. Do we have appropriate PPE assessments or other chemical handling assessments, because we might have slightly changed the chemical and it changed the constituents? For logs and data, always looking at incomplete calculations, missing information, inaccurate information, or frankly, databases that we're not able to tell where the data came from and how the calculations are being conducted to really demonstrate compliance with air emission calculation purposes, either because we have a permit or we're proving that we don't need a permit.
Mhm.
On the water side, typical findings for stormwater, even if we have a no exposure certification, there's always things outside that show up that we don't know. The leaky trash compactor that's oil is running down to a storm drain. Just because you think you might have an indefinite no exposure certification, you may not. A 5-year renewal cycle. If you're in Pennsylvania, you have to do sampling and additional requirements to maintain that certification. When we talk about stormwater permits themselves, again, looking through your files with a critical eye, if you're not doing them yourselves, about making sure that we're maintaining all of the visual monitoring on the basis that we need, periodic monitoring, analytical monitoring, inspections, walk around, annual inspections. Again, that's that paperwork that you really want. Do I have 3 to 5 years of records for every month for every event? On the wastewater side, same thing. Oftentimes in audits, we're, like Frank said, we're on the floor and going to say, where does that drain go? Where does this pipe go? I hear water rushing. I had a facility, we could see water rushing into a sump in the floor and nobody knew where it came from. So we spent a good amount of time tracking the piping, walking up downstairs over a mezzanine, and we found out it was from an air conditioner, but they were in Washington. That was not allowed to go down to sanitary sewer without prior authorization. And so really, again, assessing your facility. So being prepared for an auditor, but when you can audit yourself in between, is looking at that. And do our applications and permits reflect current facility conditions and operations and things we may not see all the time? So DMR submittal, some of the common findings, frankly, we're just not submitting things on time. Maybe they're not assigned appropriately by corporate officials or delegation of signature authority, or that we're missing samples or missing parameters, sometimes from a new permit that was issued as well. When we talk about tier 2 reporting for chemicals that we're storing on site in excess of thresholds at any one time, many times common audit findings are we just missed them. We missed chemicals or we've changed the chemical process. Again, from an audit standpoint, where we're seeing is, okay, we're coming in every 3 years and maybe we've not done a reassessment of chemical handling or change outs. Again, I always like to give examples. So another facility I was at, that they moved from using 55-gallon drum storage to a lube cube. It changed the SPCC, it slightly changed the tier 2. We brought new chemicals on site. So making sure that we're always maintaining that, because again, in an audit, we're pulling all of those threads and we're looking back historically to say, what did we report maybe 3 years in the past? So don't forget about storage locations, and then making sure that we're frankly updating those at all times. From a TRI standpoint, same thing. A lot of times when I'm auditing, I may look at Form Rs or TRI reports last, because it's really the roll up of everything. We might be reporting on air emissions that came from our permit reports. It may be coming from hazardous waste manifest or non-haz that we're doing as an offsite shipment. We're going to have wastewater data that's reported in there, potentially stormwater data. So it is a roll up of many of our programs. And again, if you think of pulling that thread, they all need to match. And sometimes common findings is that we're inconsistent with how we report something. And so always checking those programs that they match together. Theoretically, we're doing that when we're preparing the report, but sometimes we're preparing reports kind of in a vacuum. And this is how we do TRI, and this is how we do air, and this is how we do waste. And sometimes those don't match. And then also chemical naming, back to chemical management, to Frank's point. Just a blurb on the environmental side is we're always looking at those CAS numbers. Don't take for granted that you can read an SDS potentially and see all the chemicals that are in there. So I say, we've got chemicals that have their common name and their fancy name. And sometimes we see their fancy name and we don't realize what that chemical is, and we really need to evaluate it for multiple EHS programs potentially. On the waste management side, as you all can imagine, just incorrect waste management practices in total. So profiling, container management, and applicable waste codes. We've got the wrong waste codes because we changed processes. And again, that's what we see in the audit is sometimes we don't reassess those things in a timely manner that we need to, and an audit really highlights that. We pulled this chemical out of the process, and so we no longer have those waste codes, or we added this process and we need new waste codes that we have. And then record keeping, again, many documents related to hazardous waste management. Also, potentially, if you're in Pennsylvania, another one of those states where we've got residual waste and some non-hazardous waste that have very specific record keeping, reporting, management requirements. And so always having all of those documents together, and they're signed, they're maintained, they're submitted in a timely manner. Facility plans, this is kind of the catch-all, Frank. I should have emergency action, emergency response plan here too. But typical in audits, right? We're going to read your plans, every word. And some of you may have never read your plans word for word. And so we do a lot of pre-audit calls, and that's why we ask for those things. I want your written plans, I want your written programs, and we're going to read those. And in those plans, it's going to say, I'm going to call 911 in an emergency. And that's when we say, what's the response time? The plan's going to say, we're only going to respond to spills or we're going to respond to every spill. And then you get on site and you say, no, we only respond to 5 gallons or less. Names have changed, processes have changed, our procedures have changed. And so really when you look at plans, take those plans off the shelf if you haven't already, read through them, make sure they're accurate. Again, I had one where they referenced a construction project as a particular part of the plan, and it was completed in 2019, and they had recertified the plan, updating it every year since, because they were doing annual reviews. And it's like, well, half your plan is still many years old, so we need to update it. So just making sure that those things are current, and making sure we've got all the inspections there and references that need to be in there. So last item here is training. This is training in all programs. Training's difficult to keep up with, and we know that. So when Frank and I are auditing, we're working with facilities, we're helping with facilities. We know that in a perfect world, sometimes these are difficult to manage just because of the influx of new hires and people that are coming in. So looking at training, are we training everybody that needs to be trained on the frequency that they need to be, even new hires? Don't forget about those new hire people. Some regulations will say you have to train them within 6 months of being hired or within 90 days of being hired to do this task. So oftentimes when we're auditing, again, we see a person on the floor, and then we're going to track them through the system. And we're going to say, okay, I saw Frank Rooney. He had on a respirator. He was driving a fork truck, and he was, spray painting in the paint booth. So I need to see all of his training records, and we need to see the content. So when you think about auditing, as we've gone to online systems and online portals, sometimes it's very difficult, frankly, to see the content unless you take the training. Well, we're not going to typically take the training while we're there on site, but you need to, typically we have to find a way to get the content, because most of the regulations are very specific and prescriptive about what needs to be in the training. So this is really kind of a big bucket of missing records, inadequate content, old content, and similar that we would need to keep those updated. So again, and I was going to say, we got plenty of examples on all those, but yeah, are we training people to what we really want them to do is the key, and to the level of detail that the regulations require. So from that, just know that there's links and helpful information out there. There's a lot of checklists. So for the environmental side and for the OSHA side, many states have site-specific program checklists. This is what I need to do as a large quantity generator. This is how I submit a complete report. This is what I need for SPCC plans and similar. So don't feel like you're on your own. Don't feel like you're just out there on an island, maybe as a sole EHS manager of saying, I'm overwhelmed and there's too much. But there are a lot of useful checklists out there. I was going to say Wisconsin, for one, they always had a number of nice checklists. Ohio has a lot of good information. California has some great information. Now it's going to be California specific, but it has the federal citations for waste management, and then always OSHA website as well to go out there and find template forms, template checklists that you may be able to use. So thanks for your time today.
Yes, thank you.
Amy, Frank, great job. We do have one question. For a new and small company with little EHS program history, what are the biggest regulatory risks? What should I be working on?
Sure. I was going to say, Frank, do you want me to take that? I'll say, as a good environmental consultant, I'll say it depends. So as a small facility, I think, frankly, you're going to have to start out with some sort of maybe a risk assessment, identification of what categories I'm in, and what are these programs? So distilling it down. Frank, I may
Yeah.
answer for health and safety. Are we using respirators? Do we get into confined spaces? We might have powered industrial vehicles and things like that. So we need to focus on the environmental side. Do I have do I have an air permit? Do I have a stormwater permit, wastewater permit? And maybe distill it down to what is applicable, and then really start taking those one at a time, to
Yeah.
not maybe be overloaded and just focus on one program, one requirement, getting it in place, and maybe moving to the next one. But Frank, you may have different ideas.
No, I was saying you're right, Amy. And quite honestly, there's two things that you probably have to do at every site. One is get out in an emergency. So you probably always need to have an EAP. And OSHA requires that if you have 10 or more employees, how you train them and all that stuff. But again, if you get out, everybody's got to get out of their site in the event of a fire or whatever. And the second one is HAZCOM. Like I said, even if you're not a chemical facility, you're going to have maintenance chemicals on site, cleaning chemicals on site. And HAZCOM is kind of a universal standard. I don't really care how much chemicals you have, but you're obligated to train your employees on where those chemicals are and how they get the chemical information. Those are just two basics. And then from there, you just got to kind of look around and see, what are my risks? What's going on here? It's a small facility, which means you probably have one of everything, which is a real pain in the neck, because that means you have to have a program for everything, even though you have one fork truck. You got one person wearing one respirator. You got one person who has the machine gun. That's unfortunate, but then those things are all triggered, and you have to put those programs together, and then it becomes a priority. Where's my biggest risks? But overall, got to get people out of the building, and you probably have chemicals.
Frank, maybe one other thing on that point that I'll say, because Frank and I were at a facility where they had limited resources. So I'm not saying that you need to spend money and time and effort, but sometimes we were at a very small facility that had a lot of high risk operations. And in that facility, the recommendation is we probably need to outsource some things. So if you're a small facility and you have things that maybe you're not comfortable being able to manage, maybe for a short term might need to outsource those. I guess, Frank, in this case, it was handling of compressed gases. It was some work at heights. It was some roof work, some other things. And they just said, look, we don't have the capacity to handle that right now, and we're going to need to provide our service contractor for maintenance of equipment. So sometimes, depending on what you have at your facility, there are some options to say, I just need to take this off my plate right now. It may come back onto my plate, but then having those programs, reliance on contractors may help as well.
Well, great job, both of you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who attended today. Just a reminder that our webinars are recorded and are viewable on EnSafe's website. Usually takes a week or two to get them posted. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. And that concludes our presentation.
All right. See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.